This is a review of my Bodes Ve8 1/8 scale electric buggy. I've actually had this chassis for quite some time, a little over a year, but I wanted to wait until I had an opportunity to go racing with it before giving a fair review. Typically I race my 1/10 scale chassis and the tracks that I go to don't do 8 scale, so I had an opportunity this past weekend. I literally just got back to go racing with this. So there are several things that I'd like to point out about this chassis that I believe are deficiencies, but I just want to point out, on the whole, I do like this chassis very much. I think it's an excellent chassis. Okay, but I just want to go over the weaknesses so that if you have one yourself, if you want to get one, you at least have an idea of what to work around. So the first thing is the body. It's worth pointing out that there aren't many vent holes here. There's one here, okay? Now the speed control mounts back here, and the motor mounts up here, and the battery mounts over here. There's only this one vent hole. The only other opportunities you have to make vent holes would be to either cut open the windshield or to cut more around the front here to let more air in. Of course, you get more dirt in. So it's a nice looking body. I like it. But it doesn't leave many opportunities for ventilation. And I have the same problem with the HPI Cyber 10B. It's a similar kind of body, not very good for ventilation. I did get a Proline Bulldog body for this chassis. This is actually for the D8, but the D8 and the VE8 are almost exactly the same. I did make the mistake of not cutting the front hole exactly right, so I had to do this bit here. The front hole cutting point is a little different on the VE8 than for the D8. So when you get this, if you do get this body and you see the little notch on the body where you would cut the hole, don't cut it there. Just place it over the chassis and try to mark out the exact position where you should cut it. Because now I don't have Lexan up here and I have to mount the front clip over this, and sometimes this sort of pops out in the front, so I don't really use this. The other thing is, the body is wider than the chassis, so I had to put some foam on the sides here just to prevent dirt from getting in, because they do not make dirt guards for the sides of this chassis here. They do make it for the D8, and I did try those, but those are meant to mount on an aluminum chassis. This is a molded chassis, so they don't mount right. So I'll take the body off now that we've covered that. Let's put this aside. It's a little dirty. Again, I just got back from racing, and it was a clay dirt mix, so that's why it looks all red. Another thing to point out here are the differentials. The differentials themselves are perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with them. But the way that the manual tells you to install them is with the bevel gear facing this way on the front, and I believe this way on the rear. And if you do that, and you mount a normal motor that turns in the normal direction, the car will actually go backwards. So you have two options. You can either get a speed control that supports reversing the motor, and there are several racing speed controls that don't do that, particularly LRP, but there are several that do, like this Tekin RX8. Your other option, which is a better option, because when speed controls operate in reverse, they don't always supply full power to the motor. Your best option is to take the differentials and flip them around. I checked this online. When I first built this, I didn't realize that when I mounted this motor, the car would go backwards. And sure enough, they say just turn the diffs around. So take this one, flip it over, take this one, flip it over, and keep everything else the same. The car will then go forwards when you apply throttle. These mud guards here, they do make... DE Racing, I believe, makes mud guards for the D8. You can get those, and they should fit this. At the time that I got these, the ones for the D8 were out of stock, so I got them for the D8T, the Truggy, and they're longer, so I just used a Dremel and just tried to cut them to fit. It's really just a piece of plastic, so you don't even have to get these if you don't want. You could just cut some spare Lexan you have lying around and mount them, and it's very easy. The one screw that mounts them is a screw that holds on the ball joint for the anti-roll bar, and then the other screw is the screw that holds in the hinge pin for the rear hub carrier. Okay, and then you just cut it to fit how you want. So that's the mud guards. Let's see, the rear shocks. So these are not the stock rear shocks. The stock rear shocks are actually the same height as the front shocks. And they come with, I think, softer springs in the rear. So I had first used it like that. I was playing around just in the parking lot, and it works okay. But I noticed that it tended to bottom out quite a bit. I didn't have enough shock travel, so I bought the longer stroke shocks. And in order to make those work, you have to get an upgraded shock tower. So the shocks and the shock tower combined, I don't remember how much it costs, but it's probably around $100 for that. The skid plates on the bottom, front and rear, I got the aluminum skid plates. As you can see, they're pretty nicely worn. The chassis comes with molded skid plates, and I haven't tried them. It's just when I got this chassis, I read around and on forums and stuff, and I found out that the recommendation is to get aluminum skid plates. So I got those. They're, I don't know, maybe 20 bucks a piece. So there's that. What else do I want to talk about here? Ah, yes, the motor mount. One of the big complaints about this chassis is that there's not a whole lot of space to mount a 4S pack, and that the spacing between the pack and the pinion gear is very tiny, and that limits what kinds of battery packs you can use. I use the Orion 40C carbon packs, 5100 milliamp hours. They fit just fine. So I don't remember the dimensions of this, but if you just look this pack up and you find a pack that has the same dimensions or comparable dimensions, it should fit just fine in this chassis. The stock motor mount did make it rather difficult to mount the pinion gear, because the way that the stock motor mount works, it just forces you to push the pinion out a little further. And what ended up happening, at least with this LRP motor, was that the grub screw that holds the pinion on was only half on the edge of the actual output shaft of the motor. So it would come loose on occasion. So if you get the aluminum motor mount for this chassis, that's another $30, $40 investment. It does have a little inset into the motor mount. It allows you to push the pinion gear in a little bit. You get better mesh to the spur gear, and crucially, you have some more space here to fit the grub screw onto the output shaft of the motor. So it fits nice and snug, which is good. Let's see. What else? Ah, yes. So the main deficiency among all of these with this chassis has to do with the drivetrain. And in particular, it has to do with the universal shafts. So this is an example universal shaft. I just took out the drive pin and the grub screw and everything. So you'll notice on this bit here that there's no notch that would fit a C-clip or maybe an O-ring, depending on what kind of other chassis you might drive. I think Losi uses O-rings and Associated uses C-clips. And what happens is, the drive pin goes through this, and then you put a little grub screw into here to tighten the drive pin down. And there's a little notch in the drive pin to fit the grub screw in, and you use thread lock to hold it all in place. The problem is, even if you use really good thread lock, it will eventually come loose, and the pin will fall out. And I've had that happen multiple times, a couple times in the rear. I had it happen to the front center drive shaft yesterday when I was racing, and then today one of these popped out. I think it was this one, the pin popped out. So as it is stock, if you're just playing around, just make sure you use good thread lock, and make sure you're prepared for the possibility that those pins may pop out, and you may want to just get some spare units. Or there's a company called Techno RC, and they make upgraded universal joints for the D8 and the VE8 that have basically a C-clip on the outside here to hold the pin down. And one pair of those costs about $40. So 2 pairs, that's about 80 bucks, plus the pin retainers for the center drive shafts, that's another $20 or so. So even though this chassis comes, box stock as a rolling chassis for about $300, The aftermarket parts you'll have to get for it, the skid plates, the drive shafts, the front and rear from Techno RC, preferably the Techno RC pin retainers for the front and rear center drive shafts, the aluminum motor mount, the rear shock tower, the rear shocks. You'll basically end up spending about $500 or more to effectively complete this chassis and to make it more race worthy. So you could go out and spend $500 on an RC8BE or a Losi 8 2.0 or something like that, and you'll also get a very good chassis from those companies. So again, I do like this chassis. I do like the fact that it starts at $300, and you could just build it box stock and not buy any of these aftermarket parts and be pretty happy with it. And then over time, you can buy all these other components as you see fit. So, that part of it's pretty decent. In terms of tunability, it has all the same tunability features as any other high-end A-scale chassis. It's pretty easy to work on. I do like the fact that the differentials are easy to access. Maybe I would assume other A-scale chassis are like this, because all you got to do is just take the front gearbox off this way, just a couple screws, diff pops out. You can change your diff oil, because these are gear diffs, pop it back in, and you're ready to go. If any of you are familiar with the associated SC10 4x4, it's a much more of an operation to work on those differentials than a chassis like this. So this is pretty simple to work on. Most of the parts are very robust. I haven't broken anything on this at all. The only problems I've had, again, were the drive pins popping out on the universal shafts. So I think that's pretty much it in terms of what I think this chassis could use if you decide to get it. I do like the fact that it comes with a molded chassis instead of an aluminum chassis. Some people criticize it for that, but it is more lightweight. I do like the fact that you have the option of using mechanical brakes on an electric A-scale buggy. I have not done that, but they do offer the parts in the box to build the mechanical brakes as you would for a nitro chassis, and you can adjust front and rear brake bias. It takes a lot of load off of the speed control. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it. I don't have any other main comments. I do like the chassis. It was a lot of fun to drive. I have plenty of work to go in terms of setup. It's not set up quite right. But that's my review.